One of the most common and frustrating issues I see with furniture that I'm working on are wobbly drawers. Now, sometimes it is caused by a wooden guide that is missing completely, such as here and here. Sometimes the guide is still there, but it's broken. It's either worn off or there's strips missing out of it. I'm going to show you how I recreate them with a table saw. Stay tuned. My name is Angie and I refinish furniture. Sometimes I paint and sometimes I don't, but I always do what I can to save old pieces from the trash. Welcome to my workroom. So even if the wooden guides are still there and they're intact, sometimes you need to replace these plastic pieces to make a drawer stop wobbling. Or it could be a problem with this section that's attached to the underside of the drawer, or these metal tracks. But if it's the wooden guide that is inside the dresser that is the problem, and you happen to have a table saw or know someone that does, it is going to save you a ton of time and money to just recreate them yourself, regardless of whether it uses a track like this or one of these little plastic pieces. Now there's three shapes that I run into the most. This is what I call the H shape. It literally looks like a sideways H. Some have more of a fat T shape, like this one here, which I find is the most common one that I run into. And some are more of a block rectangle like this one here that just pushes up a channel. All three of these are super easy to do on a table saw. And I've seen these made out of plywood, I've seen them made out of MDF. I prefer using some type of hardwood, whether it's maple or ash, and I often use leftover scraps from other projects to save money. So there's a few things I need to do in terms of setup. The first thing I need to do is make sure that I have the blade slightly higher than the wood that I'm cutting. Take one of the good guides that are left on the piece off. This is going to be your template. I usually just put it right up against the rip fence, push it up against the blade. That is the width that I need to cut. These are quite narrow cuts, and I like using this gripper tool because it has two different sized feet. There's a very narrow one which makes this a lot safer, and it keeps your hands away from the blade. There is a problem here though, and that is with the riving knife. You can see that if I push this along, it will clear the blade, but it won't clear the riving knife. But this is usually adjustable, and the reason the riving knife is so high here is because this saw came with a blade guard. It is a good idea to use both the blade guard and the riving knife, but if you're only going to keep one, keep the riving knife. So I'm just going to drop this down, and you can see here there's two different sets of holes. I'm going to put it down on the lowest setting, and now the gripper will clear the riving knife and the blade as it goes along. It's a good idea to check your alignment of your blade every so often, but especially after you do any sort of adjustments to make sure that it's square. Another thing that is a good idea to do, especially if you're fairly new to a table saw, is to do a practice run through. Do the motion of what your hand is going to do as you push this along the blade before you even turn the blade on. And you want to stand to the side of the blade too, not directly behind it. Even with this simplest cut, there's always a risk of kickback, and you do not want to be standing directly behind the blade if that happens. Now you totally have the option to simply replace the ones that are broken or missing on that specific piece, but what I like to do, because this is such a common problem, I tend to make a few extra. Most of the tracks are going to be very, very, very similar in width. The only difference tends to be the depth, so the measurement from the front of the dresser to the back of the dresser. I find 20 inches is a good length when I'm doing batch replacements, and then when I get a piece that happens to need one of these, I can trim it down to the 17 or 18 or 16 inches that that specific piece needs, as well as any other little tweaks. For example, the piece that I was making these for has this little notch out of it, and you can cut this with a dado stack. I don't have a dado stack, so what I'm going to do is multiple passes. Takes a little bit longer, but I find it kind of fun. Now most table saws come with a rip fence and a miter gauge. When you're using the miter gauge, you always want to move the rip fence out of the way. You only want to use one of these at a time, not both. So once you have your blade set to the correct height of the notch from your template, all you really do is just go back and forth. Make sure you keep your fingers clear of the blade, obviously, and just hold the wood tightly against the miter gauge. This actually goes pretty quickly, and I'm going to do this for all of the pieces. So once this is finished, I need to add some holes where these get attached to the dresser. Now these originally had nails. I don't like using nails. I prefer screws that are countersunk. It just makes it easier to take them in and out if needed. Typically what I'll do is I'll use a drill bit the proper size for the screw I'm going to be adding, and then either use a countersink bit like I'm using here, or a little later when I show you how to do the H version, I just use a bigger bit to make the countersink area. I figured this is a good time to let you guys know or remind you that I am not a woodworker per se. I'm still fairly new to things like table saws and miter saws, but this was one of the first things I learned or taught myself how to make because it is one of the most common repairs that I have to deal with. If you're new to table saws or any kind of power tool like that, I suggest that you watch some YouTube videos dedicated specifically to safety on them. They can be really dangerous if you're not careful. Once you have this all cut, all you have to do is reattach it to the piece, and I usually like to add a little bit of beeswax or some similar coating. These H-style guides are a little bit, I don't want to say trickier, but they do take a little bit longer. They have these 2 channels on them, and I see these most often with those metal tracks that I showed you earlier. Every now and then a plastic guide will be attached to it, but it's usually the metal ones I find, and because of that, they tend to get really chewed up over time. So one thing to note about the following sequence of shots here, this was filmed on a different day than the first section that I showed you, and I didn't realize it at the time. And I think it's because I'm so used to working on wobbly pieces on my uneven floor. I didn't realize that this table was wobbling a little bit. Obviously, you want to try to make sure your saw, if it's a mobile saw like this, is on flat, solid ground. It wasn't an issue when I was cutting because it was a constant pressure forward and everything was stable, but as you can see here while I'm setting up, there is a little bit of wobble. So I just wanted to mention that before you guys come at me. I didn't notice it at the time, but looking back at the footage, I thought, oh no, it's all wobbly. So setting things up here, you can see on that piece of maple, there is a price sticker on it. I did purchase this as a scrap from a hardwood specialty store, and they often have trim pieces that you can pick up for fairly cheap. So that's what I'm using to make these H-style guides. And it just happened to be the exact width I need to make these. I really like using maple for these specific ones because maple is less likely to splinter than some of the other ones. I just need to trim this down a little bit to get the exact same height as my template. What's nice too about batch producing these is that once you have a measurement set up, you just grab your next piece of wood and cut it as well. So instead of doing one piece at a time in its entirety, start to finish, it becomes more like an assembly line. You do each cut for each piece at the same time, and then you move on to the next stage. Now, there are a lot of different carpentry and woodworking tools to make measurements. These guides, in my experience anyway, don't have to be absolutely precise. So all I'm doing is visually marking where these channels are going to be, and then I'm going to drop my blade down to the same height as my template piece. Then I'm going to adjust the fence so that the blade is on the inside of my markings. And before I move the fence over to take off the next pass, I'm going to grab the rest of my pieces and cut the first pass on all of those. Again, it comes down to batch producing and being more efficient. Once all of my pieces have their first pass, I'm going to flip them over and start the channel on the underside. Once each piece has its first pass on the top and the bottom, then I can adjust the fence to take the next pass. And then I'm basically going to repeat the process. Once everything is done, it's good to give it a nice light sanding, and then of course you want to test it. And you want to have a little bit of movement. You don't want it so tight that it barely moves. You have to have a little bit of wiggle room. This particular dresser required pieces that have holes on each end that are countersunk, so all I'm going to do is drill my main hole, and then I'm going to come back in with a bigger bit and just drill down a tiny bit to countersink it. It's kind of an alternative if you don't have a countersink bit. And usually I just lay the template over top of the new one and punch where the hole needs to be. When you're using this method with the slightly larger drill bit, you want to slowly get up to full speed, but you don't want to put very much pressure downward. If you do, you run the risk of splitting your board. So just go very lightly. Sometimes you can wiggle back and forth like I'm doing here to widen the hole a little bit. You just don't want to go down very deep or split it, obviously. To make the T-shaped ones, it's basically the same thing as the H's. You want to map out where your channels are and then just make multiple passes. The T-shaped ones are basically just the H's without the bottoms. Now, I know this was a very quick sort of introduction to this and not super technical, but hopefully I've given you enough to make you feel confident that you can tackle this, because it's really not difficult. But if you're doing a lot of dressers, which to be honest, most of our bread and butter is as furniture flippers and restorers, you absolutely will find wooden drawer guides like this that are broken or missing and need replacements. And like I said, buying them online is an option, but they're quite expensive and usually not custom to the piece, so this is just a very easy way to do it for yourself. Nothing feels better than sliding your drawer in after you have replaced your runner. It just feels great. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.